One of the things that I absolutely love about Vue are its composables. And composables are just simple little functions that can handle a lot of complexity for you. So let's say I wanted to track mouse coordinates. So whenever the user hovers over the screen, all the numbers update. And while it's not very useful, it looks super cool. So let's just go and build it. So first, I would need a template that displays the coordinates of the mouse. And then I would need to create reactive references to hold these coordinates. So now to get the actual mouse events, I need to create an event listener on the window for mouse move. And this isn't going to work as is because we need to create this event listener only when the component is ready. So Vue 3 provides a set of functions known as the Composition API that give you access into the component lifecycle, reactivity functions, amongst so many other great things. So I can wrap this event listener into the lifecycle hook called onMounted. But I also need to destroy this event when the component itself is destroyed, or we'll just have like a leaking listener that's hanging out. So to do that, I can do that in another lifecycle hook called onUnmounted. And now this is great because whenever the mouse moves, the values are automatically updated on the screen, and I just feel like I could just be here all day doing this. So as much as I love this code, what happens when I need to use it outside of this component? Well, the Vue Composition API makes this incredibly easy because we're already like 90% of the way there. This is exactly what a composable is for. So we can take all of this code and refactor it into a separate file. And now this might just look like the same code in a function put in a separate file, but there is so much more going on. This is incredible because there are these free floating functions like onMounted, onUnmounted, and ref, and they are aware of the components they are being used in, even though they are in a separate file. And this makes composing logic across components so much easier. And my absolute favorite part about composables, if you need a specific composable, there's probably already one written for you. There's an entire library called VueUse, which is a massive library of pre-built composables, including a use mouse composable that is so much better than the one I just wrote. Oh, and there's even a few Firebase composables. So seeing how composables can handle such complex bits of logic with such ease, it got me thinking about what more could be done with Vue and Firebase. So we formed a team. We teamed up with the one, the only Eduardo San Martin Morote, and now we have a full-blown VueFire library full of Firebase composables. And these composables integrate Firebase into Vue and make it so much easier to get data in real time, monitor authentication state, upload files, and so much more. In this video, I'm going to cover 6 major areas of VueFire: Firestore setup with the emulators, authentication composables, protecting routes with Vue Router and Authentication, Firestore composables, using Firestore queries within those composables, and handling route state with Firestore queries. And at the end, we're just going to deploy the whole thing to Firebase hosting. So when you combine all of these together, you can build incredibly powerful things with just a little bit of code. So by the end of this video, you will know everything you need to be effective and productive in Vue and Firebase. So what are we waiting for? Let's get started. Whenever I open up a project, one of the first things I do is look at the package.json file. And this is truly the heart of what's going on in a project. You can see all the libraries that are being utilized and the npm scripts, which will tell you how to get things up and running. In this case, we can see that this project is using all of these following libraries. The project itself was set up through Vite's own project initialization. However, afterwards, the Firebase libraries were added for Firebase and VueFire. Now, let's get Firebase up and running. So we can do that with these npm scripts. So to get it up and running, we're going to be using the Firebase npm script that runs the Firebase local emulator suite, which allows you to develop on Firebase without connecting to a cloud-based project. And then also in this project, I'm using this new web frameworks integration in the Firebase CLI that can detect Vite and manage the build. So when I run this command, it will also kick off the Vite dev server. Just make sure that you enable the web frameworks experiment with this following command: Firebase experiments : enable web frameworks. And then finally, we can run the npm script for npm run Firebase. So this video is going to focus on using VueFire with a pure Vite project. However, you can use VueFire with Nux 3. There's a plugin today that Eduardo made that it's still experimental, but if you want to give it a try, please give us some feedback and I will drop a link to that in the description. Once the emulator suite and Vite are up and running, let's open up the localhost port. The site is up and running locally, so now I'm going to get VueFire set up. VueFire is configured within Vue's app bootstrapping process, and this is done within the file main.js. So here you'll find a create app function that takes in the root Vue component and then allows you to call the .use function to apply different configurations and different libraries. In this case, the Vue Router is already set up, which you can see from all the routes that are created above. And don't worry, we'll be getting into that in just a moment. VueFire's setup works similarly to Vue Router. I'm going to call the .use function again, but this time supply the VueFire plugin and then some configuration. The plugin needs to know the Firebase app instance and any extra Firebase modules needed. And in this app, I'm going to use the VueFire auth module. And this sets up some monitoring of the authentication state while the app bootstraps and a few other useful things as well. And right now, actually, this is the only module that you need to specify because you can use Firestore, cloud storage in VueFire, all without supplying a module. One thing to note here is that I am not initializing a Firebase app. I'm just calling getApp, which returns the default Firebase app instance. And this is because of an amazing feature within the web frameworks experiment. When this experiment is enabled, it will automatically retrieve your app configuration and create a Firebase app instance for you. And when you run Firebase emulators : start, it will automatically connect the Firebase app instance to the emulator suite. So the site is running and we're connected to the emulators. But in general, a whole lot of nothing is happening, so let's change that. The goal is to log a user in and monitor their authentication state. So let's open up auth.vue. So when you're using VueFire, you're going to be using a mix in between the regular Firebase JavaScript and VueFire libraries. When using authentication, you'll use the regular JavaScript library to sign in users. So in this SFC, I'll import the needed functions for logging in with Google, and I'll create an instance of the authentication service. Now to sign in with Google, I'm going to attach the click event on the login button to the sign in with redirect function. When we go to see the changes in the browser, you'll notice that the page hasn't refreshed. And this is something that I'm hoping that if you're watching in the future, you will have this issue. However, right now, you need to manually refresh to see changes in dev mode, but hang tight because we're working on this. So if you've been wondering, how are these variables available in the template? Then it's time to introduce you to setup scripts. This is a feature introduced in Vue 3. This tag in the SFC allows you to expose bindings to the template. When we declare a variable in the setup script, it's available within the template. Just a nice bit of syntax sugar. As far as authentication goes, when I go to log in, the emulator suite gives me this nice UI that I can use to either create a user or pick from a list of existing users that I have already preceded. Now I'm going to pick myself, and when I come back, nothing happens. And that's because we're not detecting the authentication state. So let's use VueFire to change that. So VueFire comes with a composable that checks updates every time the authentication state changes. Once this user variable is created from the composable, the template will update each and every time the authentication state updates. And I'm going to update the template to display the user's info and conditionally render elements. The login button should not show if the user is logged in, and the logout button should not show if there is no user. And the same goes for displaying the user's information. So now that we have basic authentication up and running, let's do something a bit more complex. One of the most useful combinations when building Vue and Firebase apps is using authentication with Vue's router. Vue provides a separate library for a router, and this project is already set up with Vue Router in main.js. There's an array of routes and their respective components. One thing to note here is that I'm using named routes, and I love named routes. Why? Because even if the route changes, the name stays the same. So if /city/:id changes to, let's say, /cities/:id, none of my route links break because they reference the route name of city instead of the actual path. And that's just fantastic. So now for the fun part, protecting routes. I have a route called forbidden and a route called Firestore. And I only want authenticated users to be able to visit the Firestore route. And if they are not authenticated, they should be redirected to the forbidden route. So to achieve this, I can write a route guard. A route guard runs inside the before each loop of the router instance. This loop runs each time a route is navigated to, and we can see the to and from routes as parameters. Inside here, we can check to see if a user exists using the same composable as before. One thing you might notice is that I'm using async await with the composable. This allows me to get the user value one time and waits until the user has returned before proceeding, so I know that I have a valid value on the next line of code. This is where I can check to see where the route is going and if the user exists. If the route is Firestore and the user does not exist, I want to redirect them to forbidden, which all I have to do is return a route object from this if statement. And while this does work, it's not entirely reusable. If I want to protect more routes, right now I'd have to create this complicated if statement. So instead, I'm going to use a little trick from the Vue Router, the meta object. Within each route, I can create a customized meta object. And this can really contain like anything you want. And I'm going to use it to mark a route as protected. So now that I have marked each route as protected, I can check this in the before each loop. Instead of checking for the route name, I'm just checking for the existence of the isProtected property on the meta object. If it has the isProtected property set to true and the user does not exist, we'll redirect to the forbidden route. So let's check this out in the browser, and I'll make sure that I'm logged out. Then I'll try to go to the Firestore route, and it redirects me to the forbidden route. So now I'll log in, try to visit Firestore again, and now I'm good because, yeah, I'm logged in. One last thing to note here is that you can resolve data inside of the before each loop. When I said you can put whatever you want in the meta object, like you really can. Since I'm getting the user for most routes, I'm going to attach the user onto the meta object. Now within a component, you can get the current route using the router's useRoute composable. And from there, you can see the route.meta.user property. However, one important thing to note is that the user or any reactive data that you might attach onto the meta object is no longer reactive when it's resolved from the router. So if you want to maintain reactivity, there is another trick you can do. So instead of resolving the user onto the meta object, we can resolve the user data to the underlying cache, so it's ready on the reactive instance within the component. I like to call this pattern reactive priming because it sounds so cool. Actually, there's probably a real name for this pattern, so don't call it that. But now, all you have to do is use the composable as you currently are, and when the component mounts, the user value will already be available and it will still be reactive. Now, that's pretty much the fundamentals of what you'll be doing with authentication, so let's move on to getting data with Firestore. VueFire ships with a whole set of composables for binding real-time data from Firestore to your templates. So like I mentioned before in the authentication section, use a mix between the regular Firebase JavaScript library and VueFire. If you take a look at the emulator suite, you'll see that there is a bunch of seed data about cities. There's a city collection that has all of these cities from cities all across the world with different countries. But there's also a lookups collection that holds only the names for the countries of those cities. So I want to build a page where a user clicks on a country and it creates a query to load the cities for only that country. I'll start out by displaying a list of countries. In the setup script, I'll import the getFirestore and doc functions to create a reference to the data. Then use the VueFire composable useDocument to start the real-time binding. Then we'll create the template. I'll use the v-for directive on the button to create a button per country. Now, looking at this in the browser, we have our buttons per country, but there's this error. And this is because at first, the data isn't loaded, so there's going to be an error when you're going over iterating over the buttons. However, the data is reactive, so eventually the data does load, and then it renders out the buttons. And while this works, we don't really want errors populating up in our app. So to fix this, we can put a v-if binding on the parent to check for the existence of the data. So now I want to load all of the cities per country, and that's going to require a query. But before we can jump into queries, we need to start with something simple. So I'm going to load all of the cities by default. I'll create a reference to the cities collection and bind it to the use collection composable. Then I'll bind that to the template. All right, so we have all the cities displayed, so let's work on the querying. To create a basic query, you only need to use the Firebase JavaScript library as you normally would with the where functions and all of that great stuff to refine your query. So now we can see that this query restricts only to the cities within Argentina. But I want to do this on a button click, not just on this hard-coded query. So I'm going to create a click handler on the button that gets the button text. And this will tell us what country we need to change the query to. But how do we swap out the value of the query? Well, if you were thinking we're probably going to use a composable, then you are right. Vue provides a computed composable that allows us to create computed properties based upon reactive data. Using the reactive ref composable, we can store the initial query state. I want to know when this data changes and create a new query. And I can do this with the computed composable. This composable takes in a getter function that runs every time a reactive dependency inside changes. And that is exactly what I want. When the criteria value changes, the city source query will change as well. In the browser, whenever someone clicks on a button, the city list changes. Now, you might be wondering why I'm using this array syntax for queries with the spread operator within the query function. And this is to make the querying future-proof for any other query criteria that we might use. If I want to also restrict by population, I can do that just by adding another where clause within the reactive reference. So now each one of these cities is its own document as well. So let's turn each one of these little buttons into a link that will take us to a page that displays the city data. Remember that this app is set up as a single page app with the Vue Router, so we can't just use normal links. But we can use the element provided by Vue Router, which is router link. This element can take in the path just by using the to attribute. However, I want to use a more powerful syntax that allows me to continue to use named routes, because remember, named routes are the best. So I'm going to use this colon syntax to bind an object to the to attribute. The route name for the page is city, and we'll need to pass in an ID as parameters because that is what the route configuration expects. In main.js, you can see right here, we have the colon ID, so we're going to need to pass in params to the router link to match the two. Now when we click, this takes us to the page, but we don't have any real data. So let's work on that. Let's open up city.vue. Here we need to know the ID of the city to display. And we can do that with, yep, you guessed it, a composable. Vue Router gives us a use route composable that tells us information about the active route. Using this, we can create a reference to the city to display. And now we can display this data in the template, and let's make sure to use a v-if on the parent element so we don't get that error. And now when I click on cities in the list, I can see them pop up in their own individual routes. So I've created a really common pattern, list and detail views, but there is a critical component missing, and that's route state. When I go from a detail view back to the list view, I lose the country that I had selected before. So if I click on Argentina, and then I click on Buenos Aires, and it takes me to that page, when I go back, there's nothing to tell the list view that we were previously on Argentina. So it just loads all of them or whatever at this point. And that's not the best routing experience. So to provide a better routing experience, we need to be able to keep track of the previous state of the page. And here I'm going to do that with query parameters in the route path. To set query params, I'm going to use an instance of the router, which I can use using yet another composable from Vue Router called Use Router. This router allows you to programmatically set routes with a handful of different methods. In my case, I want to replace the query parameters every single time a button is clicked, so I'll use the router.replace method. Now, when I click each button in the browser, you can see that it updates the query parameter in the URL bar. However, when we refresh, it still only loads cities in Argentina because that's what's hard-coded. So let's change that. To get the initial query parameter, yes, you know what's next, we'll use the composable use route from the Vue Router. Then in the criteria reactive reference, I'll remove the hard-coded reference to Argentina for the country parameter. When I refresh the page, you can see that it loads the country in the query parameter. So now for the very last, but in my opinion, most easy step, deploying to Firebase hosting. This app is a Vite-based project. And I'm using Vite because Vite is really flexible. It supports all these different frameworks. It's really cool. It's got this awesome logo. It's really fast. It's like the greatest framework in the world. And then what I just, what was it? Oh, deploying to Firebase hosting. Sorry, Vite's amazing. If you remember in the beginning, I enabled the web frameworks experiment. And when I run a Firebase deploy with this experiment enabled, the Firebase CLI will detect Vite, run the build, and then deploy. And this feature works for all other different frameworks and build tools such as Angular Universal, Next.js, Nuxt, Astro, and SvelteKit. So I'll leave a link in the description and you can see what we support and what you want to use. So now that the deployment is done, I'll open up my browser to this awesome .web.app domain. And just like that, the site is live in production. Also, keep in mind that this deployed site is connected to real cloud resources and not the local emulator like we were using in development. So make sure that your cloud resources are enabled and secured when you go to production so everybody can have a good time. All right, so that was a ton of VueFire, and I hope you learned something. And if you want me to make more Vue content like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave me a comment and tell me what you want me to cover. But that is all for today, and I will see you all next time.